So Donald Trump lately has actually done some things against Russia. So that's fascinating. Now, some of the things that he's done I'm not a fan of, like the bombing of Syria that he did recently. I did a video about it over the weekend. I think that's a terrible idea. I don't need him to show us how tough he is on Russia, and certainly not with bombs. I just want to make sure that he's making decisions about Russia based on what he thinks is right. I mean, God help us on that front too. But at least that they are honest decisions and not because he's beholden to Russia for one reason or another. Again, I don't need him to prove it in the form of bombs, but it is an interesting question. And James Comey was asked about it on Sunday, and he answered that he is not sure, and that Trump might be beholden to the Russians. And that's a hell of a thing for a former FBI director to say about a president. So now, on the other hand, as I just told you, he's actually done what appears to be a decent number of actions against Russia. So not only the bombings, which is a terrible idea, but some sanctions and kicking out some diplomats that I think might be good ideas. Kicked out 60 diplomats in a response to the poisoning that happened in Great Britain, and put in place some new sanctions, etc. So is Trump actually getting tough on Russia? Well, that's the story I was set to do, especially because this morning I saw that they were pushing for new sanctions in the United Nations. And I was like, look, at some point, there's enough data in where you go, it appeared that he was being soft on Russia before, but now he's arguably being hard on Russia. And then in the middle of the day, the story completely turned. So let me explain. First, we go to the Washington Post to tell you what Nikki Haley was up to. She's, of course, our ambassador to the United Nations. Haley had said on CBS's News's Face the Nation that sanctions on Russian companies behind the equipment related to Assad's alleged chemical weapons attack would be announced Monday by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. Now, look, I don't know who did that bombing, and according to our own Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, we're not positive who did that chemical attack in Syria. So I definitely don't want bombs in response to it, but sanctions, if we were sure that they did it, then I wouldn't mind the sanctions at all. So, but we're not sure. So anyway, but they are getting tough on Russia, fair is fair. And Nikki Haley even said, so I think everyone is going to be feeling it at this point. I think everyone knows that we sent a strong message, and our hope is that they listen to us. Well, it turns out hope was delivered. They were listening, and they said in response, the Russians, that this was, quote, international economic raiding. So they said that this was done for an economic agenda and not because anyone is concerned about those chemical attacks. And they attacked the idea of sanctions in several different ways, and certainly did not agree with the bombing of Syria, obviously. So the Russians speak out. So how is that going to affect us, if at all? Because now it appears we're being tough on the Russians. Well, let's go to the Washington Post. But as officials in Moscow condemned the planned sanctions as overly punitive, Trump conferred with his national security advisors later Sunday and told them that he was upset the sanctions were being officially rolled out because he was not yet comfortable executing them, according to several people familiar with the plan. That's interesting. So all of a sudden, roll that one back. Not as much. In fact, President Trump on Monday put the brakes on a preliminary plan to impose additional economic sanctions on Russia. So it turns out we won't be doing them after all. By the way, if Trump were to have some sort of deal with some folks that are in power in Russia, whether they are government officials and or connected to oligarchs who help to run Russia, well, doing sanctions on those oligarchs would be far more relevant than some bombing campaign in the middle of Syria. Unless, of course, that bombing campaign hit a Russian soldier or plane, etc. That's why I don't want it. But having said that, this hits close to the bone for economic interest in Russia. Now, all of a sudden, Trump slams the brakes on, okay? And but Haley already said it. Apparently, she had it cleared earlier with someone in the administration. So what happened? Well, the Trump team decided to publicly characterize Haley's announcement as a misstatement. It didn't sound like a misstatement. It sounded very, very clear when she said it. Apparently the big guy did not agree. Now, is this part of a pattern? Which way is the pattern going? Being hard on Russia or being soft on Russia? Well, there are mixed signals here, as I just explained to you. So let's break it down a little further and see if we can figure out who's on one side here. So on an earlier case, relatively early on in his administration, Nikki Haley had actually also talked tough about sanctions on Russia at the United Nations. And they thought that the White House had signed off on that. Well, the guy who apparently did sign off on that was quickly thereafter removed from his job at the White House. Well, that's a sign. And here is what an anonymous US official inside the White House said to the Washington Post about that earlier situation when Trump found out that Haley had said that we were going to get tougher on Russia. Quote, "Lots of people got yelled at, some by the president." In other words, last time we tried announcing these things, Trump was furious, not at the Russians, but at us for saying that we would have imposed penalties on the Russians. Now, on the issue of the poisoning that happened of a former Russian agent in the UK, he apparently told his advisors who were pushing him to get tough on Russia on that issue, understandably so. Referring to the Europeans, he said, "We'll match their numbers. We're not taking the lead, we're matching." So very clear, don't take the lead against Russia, but we will follow. Okay, well, again, mixed, all right. So the next day, when the expulsions were announced publicly, Trump erupted, officials said. To his shock and dismay, France and Germany were each expelling only 4 Russian officials, far fewer than the 60 his administration had decided on. So apparently, his own advisors thought he meant match what all of the Europeans are doing combined, when he had said or meant match whatever is the lowest number of any of the European countries kicking out Russians. So now the camps are becoming a lot clearer once you see all the reporting coming in from within the White House. His advisors definitely want to get tough on Russia. Now, some of those ideas are terrible ideas, some of them are fine ideas, but they're in the camp of let's punish the Russians. Trump appears to be consistently against it and has to be convinced into it over and over again. Now, I know that some on the right wing think, oh, that's because he's anti-interventionist like he told us, and we believe whatever Trump tells us. Okay. Those of you on the left who think that this issue is overhyped, do you think that that Trump actually has a principle that he's in favor of peace with Russia and he's acting out of principle here? Maybe some of you do. That's not the Trump I've seen. So let's go further. The president, who seemed to believe that other individual countries would largely equal the United States, was furious that his administration was being portrayed in the media as taking by far the toughest stance on Russia. But why in the world would he be furious? Because he's got the Russian investigation being led by a special counsel that he despises. The idea that he seems to be tough publicly against Russia would seem to help him politically. Whatever the merits of that actual policy are, he's not even mad at the policy as much as he is mad at the appearance publicly that he's being tough on Russia. Now that is very curious. So why would he be mad about that? Unless he's worried about Russia's reaction. Okay, this is exceedingly clear. By the way, again, if you're in the right wing, you go, okay, I don't believe anything that the mainstream media publishes. Everything is fake news. They got in a room and just made up stories. If you're on the left wing and you've got some doubts about this story, now you might say, hey, Washington Post has a bias. But do you think they went in a room and made this up? Or do you think that these are actual sources from inside the White House? This is not the Washington Post making it up. There are sources, there are people inside the White House saying, every time we go to touch Russia, Trump gets furious. All right, more. Growing angrier, again on this issue. Growing angrier, Trump insists that his aides had misled him about the magnitude of the expulsions. And here's a quote from an anonymous official saying, there were curse words, a lot of curse words. Just picture that scene for a second. How dare you make me look tough on Russia? That's insane. Why would you say that? That's a great thing for you to look tough on Russia. Again, put the policy aside. To look tough on Russia would only help you politically. But apparently lots of curse words, really angry about that. Because yes, the US media is seeing it. Yes, US prosecutors and politicians are seeing it. But so are certain leaders in Russia. They also see things that go publicly. Okay. The incident reflects a tension at the core of the Trump administration's increasingly hard-nosed stance on Russia. The president instinctually opposes many of the punitive measures pushed by his cabinet. That's, again, the Washington Post. Now, by the way, there's one other thing that should be noted here. The cabinet is supposed to serve the president. If the president doesn't want to do it, they shouldn't do it. Now, as you can tell, I have deep concerns about Trump's actual motivation. And as I've told you many times before, I think the overwhelming majority of the evidence points to the fact that he is beholden to the Russians for whatever reason. I happen to think it's a financial reason, but hopefully the special counsel will find out the exact facts. But a president should not be controlled by his cabinet or by his advisors or by defense contractors. So the one thing that we've got to be principled on is these people don't get to, the military industrial complex and all that don't get to tell Trump what to do. They don't get to tell any president what to do. And if Trump wants to oppose them and oppose those policies, he should do it publicly, and he shouldn't be afraid to do it. But obviously internally, he doesn't want those policies at all, and he doesn't want the American people to find out what his motivations are. That's also curious. Okay, now, others note that Trump's ongoing unease with his own policy. Even as his administration has ratcheted up the pressure on Putin's inner circle, Trump has continued in recent weeks to make overtures to the Russian leader, congratulating him on his election win, and in a move that frustrated his national security team, inviting him to visit the White House. So that was a sham election. So for Trump, unprompted, to go and call Putin and say, congratulations on a wonderful victory, that also is an indication, one more time, because apparently people need overwhelming proof that he would like to be on good terms with Vladimir Putin, to say the least. Now back to the attack on British soil. Initially, the president was hesitant to believe the intelligence that Russia was behind the attack, a fact that some aides attributed to his contrarian personality and tendency to look for deeper conspiracies. To persuade him, his advisors warned that he would get hammered in the press if he was out of step with US allies, officials said. Apparently it took a long time to convince him. And again, since these are Trump advisors and aides, they're giving the president the benefit of the doubt. They think, no, he doesn't have a deal with the Russians. He's just, contrarian. He has different philosophies, and he thinks maybe someone else did the poisoning. Someone else might have done the poisoning of a Russian agent that turned on the Russians. Why? Why would they do that? Okay, anyway, no, that's not why. He never wants to punish the Russians. So I'll get to my conclusion on which way our government should go in a second. But first, again, last thing here to figure it out. Remember, they actually did do sanctions on Russia, and I pointed that out as well. Now, it's also because Congress overwhelmingly voted for it. Trump seemed to be against it, didn't enforce it for a long, long time. So what was the internal deliberations on that? In late July, Congress overwhelmingly approved new sanctions on Moscow that were widely seen as a rebuke of Trump's efforts to reach out to Putin. It took aides 4 days to persuade Trump to sign the bill, which had cleared with a veto-proof majority. Let me give you more detail. The Senate voted 98-2. There was no way that a Trump veto was going to stand. They were going to override the veto. So he had absolutely no choice, and he still took 4 days to sign the bill and had to be convinced by his aides. So look, when it comes to policy, I don't agree with the national security team that we need to be more antagonistic towards Russia, or certainly that we need to do bombings in the middle of Syria without proper investigation or evidence. So it's a funny thing, but in terms of the policy, certainly as it regards to Syria, I agree more with Trump than I do with his national security team. But in terms of who's on which side, the national security team is overly aggressive against Russia, but clearly they are the ones that are pushing the sanctions, the attacks, any kind of rebuke of Putin or Russia. Clearly they're on that side. And clearly on the other side is Donald Trump saying, no, don't do it to the Russians. Don't. Over and over and over again. And whenever he does do it, it's because they took 4 days to convince him that he basically had no choice. So come on. Look, again, if you're in the right wing, you just don't believe anything that's in the news and you don't believe any facts or reason. But I'm asking you if you're an independent or on the left wing to look at the reality of the matter and say, okay, here's where we are on policy. Here's where we are in Syria or sanctions, and everybody has different opinions on that. But in terms of whether Trump doesn't want to act against Russia, do you really believe it's out of principle because Trump is so enamored with peace? And that this is the one guy, Putin, that he doesn't want to do harsh words against. Finally, after over a year in office, in regards to the chemical attacks, he put it in a tweet and named Putin. And so that's fair, that's a data point too, okay? But overall, the overwhelming majority of the data points to he does not want to criticize Putin no matter what happens. So here we are, and again, for whatever reason, if you want to say no, you think Trump's a man of principle and he has been perfectly tough on Russia because he wanted to be, and you just don't believe any of the reporting on the issue, that's a curious choice. To the rest of us, it appears fairly obvious that Trump does not want to criticize or punish Russia. Sometimes that's a good thing in terms of policy. Sometimes it's not a good thing. But either way, I don't think he's doing it out of principle. I think he's doing it based on whatever motivations ties him personally to Russia. You just watched the video by the Young Turks, home of the revolution. If you'd like to get a lot more than that, get the full show by becoming a member. tytnetwork.com/join.